books did I read and where did I read them? Today it's time to talk about my statistics from the 2024 reading year. If you're new here, hi, I'm Kristen. Today I'm going to be breaking down the statistics from my reading year of 2024, and this is something that I don't personally put a lot of personal weight into, whether the specific breakdown of numbers of my reading. I'm not so worried. I do find that I am curious as I go through the statistics, but it's not really something that I'm thinking about over the course of the year. I don't really set any numbers-based reading goals. Something that I did really try to pay attention to and incorporate into my reading this year was how intentional I was reading. Was I reading the books that I said that I wanted to read, or was I doing a lot of spontaneous picking up of books that I really had no prior intention of reading? So that is something that we're going to be breaking down. How intentional was I reading, as well as just some of the numbers that I did track over the course of this year. So let's start off with a easy, simple number, and that is how many books did I read in 2024? The answer to that was 76 books overall. I would say that this is pretty average for me. It's maybe not as high as it was some years past, but I think it's actually a pretty good number, and again, one that I don't really care about at the end of the day. Let's break those 76 books down into a couple different categories. Let's think about them from a series perspective. One thing to note here is that I do not count any contemporary romance book as a series start, sequel, or an end. Every contemporary romance book that I have recorded in the way that I keep track of my statistics is as a standalone, and that's just because I don't feel the same amount of weight and pressure to continue on in a series when it's contemporary romance books. I DNF them a lot more readily. I don't really think of them as series that I'm working on. So just every contemporary romance books that I don't know why I keep saying books. Every contemporary romance book that I read this year was counted as a standalone. So of those 76 books, 22 of them were a new series start. I do not plan to continue on in all of those series, but objectively, 22 of them were the start of a series. I read 7 books that were the end. So a little bit of disparity there between starting and finishing series, but I did do a pretty good job with sequels and continuing on in series as well. So 16 of the books that I read were sequels or were working on as part of a series, and outside of that, then 30 were standalones, and this is definitely affected by how many contemporary romance books I read this past year, but overall, 30 standalone books, 22 series starts, 16 sequels, and 7 series ends. And that might give you a little bit of an insight into why I am focusing a little bit more on continuing on in series in 2025. One category that I didn't include there was rereads, and that is 2 books that I read this year were rereads. Breaking the categories down into genres, my largest category of books that I read were definitely fantasy books. I read 33 fantasy books this past year, and that was 43% of what I read. The next biggest category, surprisingly, was romance. I read 24 contemporary romance books, making up a 31.5 or 32% of what I read. Every other category from there came out at under 10% of my reading, but I will go through each of those with a specific number. And that included romantasy. So 7 of the books that I read this past year, I would consider, and I think generally they were categorized by the larger population as romantasy. So 7 romantasy books. I read 6 sci-fi books, 4 young adult fantasy books, and 2 books that I claimed as just being contemporary fiction, general fiction. One of which was The Vampires of El Norte, which I generally had not really sure how to categorize that book. So I put it under fiction. It could just as easily count as fantasy, I guess, but there you have it. A couple more numbers to break down things for you before we get into how intentional I was reading. One of the things that I did keep track of was whether or not an author was new to me. So whether I was reading from that author for the first time. I read from 28 new authors this year, and many of those authors I read multiple books from them. That is not something that I individually recorded. I of course only recorded it the first time, but a lot of the authors that I read from for the first time, I read multiple books of them, whether that was continuing on in a series or trying other things. I actually read quite a few new releases in 2024 as well, so books that came out in 2024. I read 25, so essentially a third of what I read were 2024 releases, which is pretty surprising. That is something that I think was a larger proportion of what I read this past year compared to other years, although I have not kept the numbers in order to reflect and compare for you. Perhaps I will next year. And I will actually say, and we'll go into this with the intentional reading, is that I didn't get access to all of the new releases that I wanted to get access to. So it's really interesting, especially considering the fact that I am primarily a library book reader. So I think I did an okay job getting new releases available to me. With that being said, there were a lot of them that I did not get access to. And then the format of how I read something. Now take these numbers with a little grain of salt, because this is not something that I recorded in the moment. I did go back through and sort of either from memory, I read this on audio versus ebook, as well as looking at my library history and my Scribd or Everend usage. However, a lot of times or for many books, I will take out both the ebook and the audiobook, especially if it works out timing wise. So I have recorded some as being a mixture, and that's based on a little bit of memory and a little bit of well, I had both copies out right at the same time, so I'm going to write it down as mix. But again, these are not specific exact numbers. It's something that I'm going to record in the moment. It's also something I'm including in my monthly reading vlogs. When I talk about the book, I am letting you know in that moment exactly how and where I got that book. So let's break this down. The biggest category by far was audiobooks. 42 of the books that I read, or 42 of those 76 books, were audiobooks. And then from there, 28 of the books were exclusively ebooks or physical. I did actually really only read one physical book, and even to be fair, 50% of that was the physical book and the other 50% I read as the ebook. So 28 of the 76 were ebooks, and then I recorded 6 as being a mix of ebook and audiobook, but really that one is a real loosey-goosey kind of number. With my phase of life and family life and career, work life at this moment, I don't have a lot of just sit down reading time. And so the fact that I'm able to do so much audiobook listening has really allowed me to continue to read this amount or extent of reading that I have been enjoying this past year, especially since becoming a mom as well. So I do really, really appreciate and value audiobooks, especially considering my stance on audiobook listening even 5-6 years ago was wildly different than it is now. So I'm really glad that I have come around on audiobook reading. And reflecting on that, I feel like I can definitely see how so many readers in the past probably lost reading as a hobby when they became mothers, let's say parents. Let's extend that out a little bit, although I think there might be some differences there, but let's say at large, I feel like there's probably so many readers of the past who were not able to maintain this hobby when they became parents. And so I do really feel privileged to be in a time where I have access to audiobooks. Okay, now the section that I really truly care about. How intentional did I read in 2024? In this past year, I made a list. It was a priority list. I totally scrapped my TBRs, a monthly TBR in general. So how I tracked whether or not I was reading intentionally had a lot to do with this 24 books in 2024. But there were also a few other ways that I kind of categorized whether or not I was reading intentionally. I also maintained a new releases sheet, an Excel sheet of books that I was most interested in month to month. So this was not extensive. It was maybe maxed out at 5 per month. And then I also made a few videos last year where I mentioned that certain books I had my eye on, certain books that I wanted to read. So in those 3 categories, I had obviously 24 books that were my priority list. I had 21 books that I mentioned in a video somewhere of that wanting to read those books. And I kept track of at least 30 new releases that were coming out last year. Let's go into each category. My biggest, most intentional form of reading this past year was definitely that list. So of the 24 books that I wanted to read in 2024, I read, or at least attempted to read, 19 of them. The attempted actually isn't even correct, so I'll go through, but overall, let's say that I read or totally DNF'd 19 of those 20 books. So that brings me in at 80%, which I don't think is bad. So out of the 24 books, I did have 2 official, I tried this, not gonna work for me DNF books, and that was Covenant of Steel by Anthony Ryan, which was one of my new series to start. Tried a couple of different times, tried both formats, didn't work for me. Along with Along the Razor's Edge by Rob J. Hayes, the writing was just a miss for me, unfortunately, so I am going to categorize that as a DNF. But I recently heard from my friend Kate that Moira Quirk does the audio. So if I at some point get access to this audiobook, I would definitely try it again. But for the sake of intentional reading, etc. 2024, it's a DNF. So let's talk about the 5 that I didn't get to. The first of which was The Obelisk Gate. This is one of the series continuations or a sequel that I wanted to read. And I did take it out from the library at some point. I will just say that it never felt right. I definitely considered it a couple times throughout the year, but there was no point at which I thought yes, that's the book that I want to pick up right now. So unfortunately, it just didn't happen. Grace of Kings, I did pick up. This was a new series start that I wanted to read. It was a new series start from the year before that I wanted to read. I think I got about 30% of the way in, and the reason that I'm not counting this as a DNF, it did not finish, is because I do feel like it was more not for now, where it just wasn't in the right headspace for that book. I at least now have a better sense of what I'm getting into with that story. And I will take that into consideration with my planning and mood reading this year. Another one was just any book by Mercedes Lackey. That was one of the category's new authors. It's not a category that I'm repeating this year, and because I don't feel like it was the most successful category, just generally at large. Anthony Ryan or Rob J. Hayes was also on that list. So I just never got around to picking up a Mercedes Lackey book, and I feel like that's because I didn't have a good sense of what book by that author I wanted to read. And it never felt the amount of work that I feel to put into figuring that out was just never right for me over the course of the year. The Sword of Kagen, again, it's not a DNF. I am currently 50% of the way into that book. I've just been 50% of the way into that book for a month now. I got stuck in the middle of the action sequence that happens right in the center of the book. And I'm just pausing there for a moment, but it is, again, one that I am going to read. I am currently reading it. It just didn't happen by the end of the year. And then the very last one there is The Land of the Living and the Dead, and that is because I only have access to the ebook. I read the first 2 books on audiobook, and there was a couple other series where I switched the format from audio to ebook this past year and didn't, or at least let's say that I noticed my experience was different. And so I am hesitating to read it because I don't want to be impacted by the change in format. I want to experience that book in the way that gives it the most, the way that I feel like I will experience it the best. And for me, that is audio for that one. So I'm just hesitating. My library still hasn't gotten an audio copy, so I will eventually probably have to read the ebook, but I'm just holding out there. So really, in the grand scheme of things, that's not bad. 2 of them, I still really want to read most of those books. They just didn't happen in 2024, and that's okay. But overall, I feel like the priority list was really successful for me, and it is something that I am going to be doing again this year. You can stay tuned for that video, or it's already out. I'm not sure which order I'm going to release these in, so if it is already out, I will link it, of course, and otherwise stay tuned. But I do have, of course, 25 books to read in 2025, with 2 new categories. I'm kind of this next section, video TBRs, so books that I mentioned in a video that I made. So I had 21 books from there, and I read 10 of those 21 books. Now, this is not there was no timeline on when I needed to read those by, so I think that 47% is actually still pretty good. I read half of the books that I mentioned in that year, when really I had no time frame on when I wanted to read those books. I'm feeling pretty good about that number overall, and it's something that it's going to be a little bit more challenging to keep track of as time progresses, but something that I will do my best to continue to record. And then new releases. I had my eye on 30 new releases. I will maybe pop those up for you to read or to see as well. I read 20 of those 30 new releases, and I think, just scrolling back, 25 new releases overall. So there's only 5 new releases that I read that weren't on a list that I was intentionally going to pick up. I think that's really good. So obviously 2/3 of what I wanted to read there I did read. 3 of them were DNFs, as you can see, and then some of them I just haven't gotten to yet. I will say also that there's a decent amount here, like for example, the Honey Witch or the Voyage of the Damned and Mirrored Heavens. Oh, and Fathom Folk as well, where I feel like that I started to, like that I maybe hesitated on because of the general reception. Mirrored Heavens was one that I was just like, I haven't even read Fevered Star yet, but I knew it was coming out and I wanted to be aware of what people were saying in regards to that series complete, like overall, as to whether or not I should continue to read like and pick up Fevered Star. Same with The Republic of Salt, which is the sequel to The Pomegranate Gate. I just kind of like want to keep an eye on the reception. So overall, I'm pretty happy with the new releases that I did read. There's definitely a lot on this list that I really want to read and don't have access to. So on Vicious Worlds, The Trials of Empire, Relics of Ruin, these are all sequels that my library is not getting a copy of, so I cannot pick them up because I do not have access to them. So that is something that I find really personally really frustrating, to have the book be out in the world and not be able to pick it up because I don't buy books. I generally, outside of the minor subscriptions that I maintain, I don't spend money on books in this way, and this is, alas, a consequence of that fact. So overall, I am actually like really satisfied when I look at the numbers as a reflection of how intentional my reading was. There definitely are a lot of romance books when I was looking through there that I don't want to say I don't feel good about, but that I kept reading simply to have something to do, to be reading something in a moment when I needed to be reading something but couldn't read other things, if you know what I mean. So while I read a lot of romance books that I did really like this year, I also read a lot that I just like don't really care about, and that is something that I find myself saying each year. So how I reflect on that, or what that means to me, is that I need to do a better job of having a contemporary romance like TBR, almost in the same way of like a priority list at large. I want to do a better job of having books and authors that I know that I can pick up, that I'm more likely to be really happy with the result, and have it not feel like, well, I wasted 4 books on that romance book club because I heard it got really good, So even though I was not really enjoying any of them as I was reading them. So something that I will try to do a little bit better on this year and just moving forward at large. But overall, I feel pretty happy with my intentional reading this past year. I could always do better. I'm hoping to do better this year, I guess. But I also know that this is something that I do for enjoyment and a hobby, and I really try to take a lot of the pressure and expectation off of myself when it comes to this hobby that I have, because I want it to bring me joy. I don't want it to be a source of stress. Well, there you have my 2024 reading year in numbers. I am really curious if you are like a really intentional reader, if you are really into statistics. I do this video in particular like more for you and more for people who are really curious about the statistics. I did really care about the intentional reading part of this year, and that's something that I'm going to be doing again. But again, if you like the numbers, if there's things that you want me to have recorded, you can let me know. It's early in 2024 or 5, so now's the time to put it into my tracking list. If there are things you want me to be keeping record of, I can always try. And I'll see you guys next time. Have a great day. Bye.